So we have this in two parts. I'm going to talk about science, actually, community-based partnerships for safety, and describe what I mean by science. My big question to everybody, I'm only going to ask one question for discussion, are we scientific enough when we design and implement projects and programs for safety at community level? And this is sort of the second part of a two-part talk, and you will have the first part of the talk there. But science in this context, what do I mean by science? I'm talking about testing a hypothesis through regularly monitoring and evaluating a project or program. And I know there are people here that are involved in that, and some people, but do we do it right? That's my question. Are we scientific enough? But I want to cover 3 points. I want to cover why evaluate at all. Many people think, oh, we don't need that stuff. Why should we bother with that? Why are so many efforts not evaluated? And then I want to cover 10 key features that I think describe a scientific effort at the community level. First of all, why evaluate at all? To me, at least, monitoring and evaluation is the means to success on all projects and programs. One can test a hypothesis to see what works, what does not, and how to improve. Then the idea is you revise that program and even the hypothesis yearly in accordance with regular findings. So if one keeps making corrections in accordance with those evaluation findings, even a bad theory evolves into a success. And that's the idea of science. There's really no bad results with science. If your hypothesis is nullified, and I worked on a project recently where the whole hypothesis was nullified, through the nullification of the hypothesis, they succeeded and found an intervention that worked. So it's not about being right or wrong, and I think many people get caught up in that. We want to prove that we're right. We want to really show that our effort is correct. And I don't think that's scientific. I don't think that's the way to proceed. It's okay to actually be wrong as long as you're presenting your information scientifically. But a challenge is what I see is most in South Africa, after working for so long, I've got to say most people view evaluation work as a checklist item. They see it as something to complete at the end of the project. And that's so wrong. This means science never feeds into the effort. I've had many people approach me and say, Rich, please, we finished our project. Why don't you come evaluate it? Well, now it's really too late. That's not the time that you evaluate. Somehow, maybe because people get marks in schools and they think of evaluation coming at the end. That's not how an evaluation works. But we'll talk about that. Another challenge is people chop and change projects based on their own agendas instead of testing a theory. Now, I believe, and this gets us away from politics and fighting, and a lot of that's what partners about, partnering, but research will help you partner because research findings and not a personal agenda should produce changes in implementation practice. It shouldn't be about proving something. But some want to prove they're right instead of testing a model. But in science, like I said, to invalidate a hypothesis is perfectly good, perfectly appropriate finding. Another reason to evaluate is to ensure sustainable outcomes. A documented success builds partnerships and support by achieving buy-in from vital departments and stakeholders, and also to engage the international community. If you go to international forums, a lot of times there's just no respect for undocumented efforts and no way to really engage international forums without hard evidence. Also, we evaluate to share learning with all South Africans. So continuous monitoring and evaluation captures learning. And I think it's wrong to leave others to reinvent the wheel. I know that people get competitive. NGOs see themselves as competing with each other for funding. And then they go, well, we're not going to let that other NGO know our secrets. But I don't think that's the appropriate approach. I don't think that's the right attitude. I think that we should be working scientifically and sharing those results. I also believe it's cost effective. Many people say, oh, we can't afford that monitoring and evaluation. And I'll talk about that today. I don't think that's correct either. And guessing at what works, how expensive is that? Monitoring and evaluating saves a huge amount of money, saves a huge amount of human effort. I don't really see it as a waste of money. I see it as cost effective if you build M&E into the approach. But many times, so why are these efforts not evaluated? Let's look at that from that angle. Why do things not get evaluated? A lot of times people don't think about it when they budget. You know, people set budgets up early enough, and they don't even have monitoring and evaluation in the project design, maybe because they think it's something that takes place down the road, which is completely inaccurate. But M&E can be designed to fit almost any budget, but the budget has to be established at project design stage. And there are cost-effective solutions. If one plans, one builds partnerships, and you can have participatory evaluations. I'll talk about this again, reviews. There's lots of things you can do to make it affordable. I also think another factor is people fear evaluations. Many think it's some kind of disguised appraisal of personal performance. I get this all the time when I go out into the field. People think I'm coming to evaluate and appraise their performance. I certainly don't do that, and that's something that a human resources manager might do, but an evaluator is not there to review personal performance. But many people think it is, and so they try to sabotage the process. This guy's going to show my weaknesses. I think evaluations are also very democratic, and those who resist them maybe not so democratic. I think it's a nonpartisan way to science. It's science. It's about finding out what's true, what's not true, and just holding with that. But people who want funds for pet projects, people that are authoritarian, they don't want evaluators around. Poor planning, sort of mentioned this, so not consulting an evaluator at the design stage, mentioned that. But final evaluations are often scheduled after implementation, but I'll tell you there's no real evaluation without a baseline study to take initial measurements. Also, sometimes you have people going with projects with no defined objectives. Now that's a real headache to any evaluator to hear that there's no objectives, because then what is there to evaluate? You have to have very clear objectives. You also see a situation where people want to throw everything in the kitchen sink of the problem. They say, Rich, come evaluate this. We've got 60 different programs going on to prevent crime. That's not so good. It's not scientific to try to address every community need, demand that arises, and then go evaluate that. It's often best to test one program theory. Often best, if you have a good theory, take it to some community where it hasn't been addressed yet, maybe, and go in there and see if this particular intervention actually works. If you tie it up with a lot of other stuff, it's going to be very hard to measure cause and effect. So now here's the heart of the talk. I'm going to talk about 10 features of a scientific effort. I'd like you to just ask yourself if you see these things being done, if you're doing these things. Now, I'm making an assumption here. I'm talking about it. It applies to everything, but I'm taking a view that the funding and expertise are coming from a government or service provider. That's the usual case. And there's local safety bodies. Last time I talked about creating local safety bodies, so if you look in your handouts today, you'll see I've already covered that. So I'm not going to cover that again. But there should be some legitimate community representatives to approach. What's the first thing you should do? Ordinarily, the first thing you should do is a scoping study to guide early discussion. This is not for publication. It remains a draft. Many people try to publish this thing and act like it's a document on its own, but it's just this is something that should morph into the baseline study. It's groundwork to inform negotiations between service providers and community representatives. Maybe if you know this community so well, and you know all the role players so well, you don't need the scoping study. Oftentimes you do, especially if you're coming from a government department. You don't know everything that's going on in Elsie's River, and you want to do some groundwork. That's when you do a scoping study, and that's normal good practice. You would cover the safety challenges, safety opportunities, available actors and resources. You come up with some safety tools that can be used in those discussions. Let's come up with some maps. Let's map the crime problems. Let's use some diagrams. Let's get some stats on what the crime problems are. Take some photos. These kinds of things can be shared. You can do a presentation when you hold your meetings. And you would analyze within that the factors that might unite or divide stakeholders on their safety issues. You do have to anticipate conflict. Don't just show up and see that it's there. Then you would enter into negotiations. It's not really part of the monitoring evaluation practice, but the monitoring evaluator should be here during this. So you bring together the actors defined in the scoping study for negotiations. And the focus of those negotiations should be an agreed safety priority, or priorities if you like, a hypothesis, what's going to solve that safety priority, a safety model to test, clearly identified objectives, and some signed memorandums of understanding so you know who is doing what. I can go over those. An agreed safety priority. What constitutes safety must be negotiated between the community and the service providers. You shouldn't just go in and tell them what you're going to do, because we're talking about developing community safety at the local level. So a priority must satisfy all parties. My advice and recommendation is you focus on a crime generator. So you shouldn't focus on individual crimes, because then that's like chasing the tail of a rat. You want to face the rat head on, and you want to look at the crime generator. So maybe it's drugs, maybe it's out-of-school youth, maybe it's guns in the community, or unemployment, or open fields, or any number of things. But it's much less expensive and more assured of results to go for the root causes than to tackle each and all types of crime. I'm not saying you can't tackle the type. You can tackle violence against women. It's okay. But oftentimes you secure better results if you're looking at prevention and if you're looking at a crime generator, trying to stop that crime generator. Then you go to a documented hypothesis. That's a theory of change. We can make it very simple. By doing X, we're going to achieve Y. So if X is job training for youth, by providing job training for youth, maybe we create less violence because fewer youth will be recruited by gangs or attracted to crime. Maybe we'll offer nice messages during those sporting activities, and we will teach youth during those events. Then you need a safety model to test. So you got this hypothesis. Let's say it's after-school programs will address loitering youth. That's our crime generator, loitering youth. And then you come up with a model. Now, there could be any number of models, a very large number of models, so you need a model. The model might be turned abandoned, overgrown fields, also crime generators, so now we're hitting 2, into sports fields for regular and supervised after-school activities. So now we're getting rid of the abandoned field, and we're also providing some program for youth, and so that could be a winner. That's your model. Then you identify and you list all your program objectives. This is going on in negotiations with the community. Maybe you identify 3 open fields that pose a safety threat, and your plan is to transform these into sports fields, and then you create 3 sports programs for rugby, cricket, and football. And then the roles and responsibilities for each objective have to enter into a signed agreement, or MOU. MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, meaning who does what by when. So maybe Public Works will organize the space for you, and I don't know who would do this, but Parks and Recreation might implement the sports programs, maybe Department of Sports. Now someone has to do the M&E. That's the part I want to get to. But these things have to take place before you can start doing the baseline study. So now you have had these negotiations, and you can start. What's the first thing you do? Now, this is interesting, because a lot of people, when I say indicators, they go, oh, that's too complex for me. I don't know what you're talking about. That is a sign that we're doing something wrong, okay? Everybody should know what an indicator is. It shouldn't be seen as some sort of strange, obscure kind of concept. Indicators is what would indicate to you the place is safer, okay? This is the key to marrying science with community-based partnerships for safety, because my argument is we can do this. We can certainly have science in our community efforts. What will indicate the safety plan is a success? So now the tricky thing about indicators, once people do latch on to the idea of indicators, they go, oh, I get it. They think they're simple. They think they're easy. So I got to tell you, I've been doing monitoring evaluation work for 20 years. That's the hardest thing I do, okay, doing indicator tables. You end up like 100 pages of indicator tables. They sound so simple. Sounds like anybody could do it, right? Very difficult. Very difficult to get these right. You've got to analyze the objectives. You've got to analyze the scoping study, the hypotheses, the safety plan, and literature. That's why you had to have them come up to a safety plan to see how success can be measured. It requires a lot of rigor to do this. So you want to have this is where you have the M&E specialists come in and design those indicator tables just as a draft to workshop. So you get your first draft indicator work done, and then now you have tables for designing data collection tools eventually. And you have 2 types of indicators. 2 types of things will indicate to you that safety is being achieved. You have process indicators. That's just what milestones will tell us we're headed in the right direction. Okay? Then you have outcome indicators. What will provide the evidence that we achieved our objectives? Then along with that, you have sources of verification and certain assumptions you make. It's good to chronicle the assumptions that you're making. People are going to cooperate in the community, etc. So maybe it's something like this. You come up with these tables, you get pages of them. I've oversimplified this, but partnerships for, let's say we're going to do a neighborhood watch kind of training. We set up neighborhood watches. So you have partnerships for training. Neighborhood watch members exist. That's your process indicator. Now your outcome is police, 3 civil society organizations, train 45 members. You get memorandums of understanding that verify that this has been done, so you got your sources of verification. Minutes could also be interviews with these people, whatever have you. You have some means of verifying that this was done. And maybe your assumption is that good relationships exist between all those partners. I won't go through all this to save time, but then you develop a curriculum. And you just lay out each little thing that you have to do. What would indicate to you progress is being made? What would indicate to you you're achieving your outcomes? And you come up with these indicator tables. And if it sounds boring, it is a bit boring. It's difficult. And it takes a lot of time. And I don't see any way around it. So if you're not doing indicator tables, I think there's a problem. Now, you workshop indicators with the service providers. You remember we're working at community level. But you could do this the other way, too. You could also workshop your indicators first with the community. What I like to do is first go to experts, service providers, people that are used to doing this, and talk to them. Maybe the Department of Community Safety, go chat with them, get them on board, and the people that are going to the service providers at that particular site, get all of them together, and get them to help me refine the indicators. Because believe me, when you draft them, they're still not right. Even an expert drafting them, they're still not right. So you refine these. You get new and better methods for capturing data on progress and outcomes. You talk to people. You say, I wanted to go get those crime stats. And somebody said, hey, what about getting those hospital admission records? Did you think about that? I'm like, oh, no, let's get those. So that kind of thing occurs. And then you get new and better sources of data identified and partnerships consolidated for delivery. But most important, your methodology is evolving in tandem with your indicators. Then maybe review this. Then you have what they call, people talk about first cut, second cut, third cut, fourth cut. You can go on with these indicators for a while. There are people that go on for a year with these indicators. I'm not saying you have to do that. But people have to, if you get these indicators right, it's a very good start. So the second cut indicator is reviewed with community members to create a third cut. And the outcomes of that, you go in and you say, okay, now I've workshopped these indicators once. I've got these indicators for designing data collection instruments. What could be captured at the community level? What's being offered at the community level? Will this convince community members, these kinds of indicators? Somebody goes, oh, no, that doesn't convince us of anything. A specialist can then design tools for the baseline study once these processes have been complete. Then you go into tool design. Okay, now a baseline study. I've got to say, I've seen so many baseline studies that are completely wrong, completely off base, completely inappropriate. It's no wonder people don't want to use them. They are not encyclopedic studies. They are not descriptive tales of everything that needs to be known about a community. They should be focused on pre-intervention measurements according to the indicators. That's why I say if you didn't do indicator development, you're not really doing research properly. You have to have those indicators. So let's say the idea is to put in creches into a community so that the mother feels safe. She can take her baby to a creche and she can go work, feed her family. That's safety. That's what it means, safety, for some people in some communities, and that's a real example. So then you've got to say, how many creches are there now? How many facilities are there now? What's the demand now? Before you ever do anything in the community. And that will provide you with tools for evaluating progress and outcomes, and the specialists who design those tools. But definitely its purpose is not some general background study, but I find many baseline studies read like that. And then people think, oh, why do we have to do these things? They're without merit. And if it is like an encyclopedic article or something, then it is without merit. So for each process and outcome indicator, you have to say what are the pre-intervention values, what tools are going to capture change. I also find that people don't know that the baseline study is linked to the evaluation. Think of it as chapter 1 of your evaluation. It's not something you do. You don't get one person to go do the baseline study and another group to go do the evaluation. They belong together. They're part of the same thing. Plus, you should have your evaluator, who's ever doing this for you, should actually be informed about the communities, should have attended those early meetings and should have discussed, should have been part of the scoping study. That same person should also be doing the evaluation. You want somebody who's sussed, knows what's going on. It should be, just think of it as chapter 1, pre-intervention measurements. It's not some separate encyclopedic article. Now, maybe our indicator of safety is community food gardens in place of unsafe and overgrown open fields. Then you have to go in now and do the baseline study according to your indicators, and your indicators might say we have so many gardens. So then How many gardens were there before the effort? What did they produce? Is this nourishing people? How many benefited? How many open fields? How many, because you're trying to replace, put community gardens where there's open fields. So how many open fields? How much crime in those open fields? You have to measure that, all of that ahead of time, pre-intervention time. You don't go later do it when you're doing the evaluation. Things will have shifted. Things will have changed. And you have to measure from point A to point B. So really, your evaluator is the first one in and the last one out. But then, what happens a lot of times, you write this baseline study, and people go, thank you very much, I'll just shove that in a drawer now. Now, that just doesn't make any sense. Now you've spent all this money on a baseline study, and you've shoved the thing in a drawer. Now, the baseline study must be a living document that guides the intervention. You should see it as something guiding you, not something that you shove in a drawer. Features that keep it alive, workshops, must be workshopped and refined with all participants. Remember, we're working at community level, so you have to workshop this thing. So the style of it has to be accessible to people who need to use it. You have to write it in really plain language. Use maps. Maps are very good. People often understand those. User-friendly tools, monitoring scorecards, baseline photo documentation. You're trying to clean up the shebeens. Here's pictures of all the shebeens now. Here's the crime around these shebeens. Do something like that. Then you take photographs later on when you're doing the evaluation. I did a big project for looking at a community prosecution model where I did exactly that. We had 9 sites around the country, and we had prosecutors go into each community, clean things up. Sia Shlala here in Nyong'o was one of our sites. At that time, I don't know what it's like now, but at that time we really cleaned it up. And I took before and after photos. Now, now you've got to integrate the baseline findings. Now you've held your workshop on the baseline study. Now, after those workshops on the draft baseline study, you have to refine the intervention plan and the baseline study. Now, your baseline study is going to come up with some information that they didn't know about when they designed the intervention plan. So now the intervention plan is going to shift a little, and then when that intervention plan shifts a little, you also have to get those last-minute pre-intervention measurements. Then you issue the final baseline study. You include in it the intervention plan, the indicator tables that you used, pre-intervention measures, and tools for measuring progress. And that's what a baseline study should look like. It should be a lot of tools. Then you test the model. Now you go ahead, that's not your monitoring evaluation specialist, but implementation should be in accordance with the documented safety plan and the monitoring tools as found in the baseline study. You find many people chopping and changing the plans in the middle of it. This is indicative of authoritarian approaches. No, we don't want to do that anymore, let's do this. You shouldn't change the plan, you should test it. And you shouldn't be afraid of failure. As I said earlier, you should be okay with it. You should be okay with testing this model. Hey, we discovered this thing doesn't work. That's how it should be. But don't change the plan, test it. Gather data on what works, what does not, to show and share with people. That process offers credibility. And then you have M&E for the life of the project, and I'm not going to, maybe that's for another lecture, but M&E, my big point is it should be completely integrated into everything. It's not something done after the intervention. There should be constant data collection, mapping safety. You can have process evaluations, what they call process evaluations yearly. 3 years without an evaluation, I think, is ridiculous. But you find many people doing that. I think you have to have an evaluation yearly, and I think it's costly. People think evaluations are expensive, but what about going on with a failed effort for 3 years without any correction? Your outcome evaluation, then you would have at a certain agreed upon point, there's no exact date. When you think the objectives are being met, go test it. Go see if those objectives have in fact been met. You've got to go gather data on it. My last slide can be affordable. M&E specialists can design tools and engage the analysis. The community can help collect the data. I did that community prosecution project I told you about that I did with the NPA, 9 sites around the country, and I had the community collect a lot of the data using mapping tools and so on, made it very affordable. So simple but effective tools like maps can be done. I had the CPFs go out and do little maps. In fact, just to let you know, you could even have high illiteracy rates, and they can still map, okay, have the community map. If you really feel like, okay, we really can't afford this M&E, just don't want it, then at least do reviews. You can go ahead and you can say, okay, we have these 8 different projects going on in different parts of, let's say, the Western Cape, in different communities. Let's bring in an M&E specialist, review several projects, and use comparative data. And that can really save on money and also generate some very good information. And that's it for me, and then I'm going to turn it over to Gideon Morris. He's going to talk about some practical examples of this.